Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy New Year, ladies and gentlemen. My name is The Advocate, and today I am an advocate for A Feast for Crows, a rereader's review. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, I have returned once again. I've completed a reread of A Feast for Crows. I've got some thoughts, so I decided, hey, why not once again provide another video review. A Feast for Crows is the fourth book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, written by George R.R. Martin. It was published on October 17, 2005, and I honestly think this might be my most improved book on a second read-through. So much improved that I was jumping for joy and decided that, hey, I think I might as well go to Old Town here and do a review of this book. By the way, don't mind the edges here. The dragons are just doing some weird things here with Old Town. Now, back when this book was first released in 2005, there was a lot of hype and anticipation in the book reading world for this book. A Storm of Swords, the book prior to A Feast for Crows, was for many people their entry point into the A Song of Ice and Fire series, so a lot of people were really looking forward to seeing how the story followed up A Storm of Swords. In fact, there was so much hype for this book that A Feast for Crows became the first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series to hit #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. Unfortunately, 5 years of hype and anticipation didn't really do this book any favors. A lot of people were disappointed with the content of the book when it was first released. Now, part of that had to do with the fact that, after spending so much time in development, not many things could live up to 5 years worth of hype. However, there was something else about this book that didn't exactly please people. Many articles criticized the content of A Feast for Crows for being too bleak and plodding, and lamented the fact that many of the key characters whose stories people wanted to follow up on were being held off for A Dance with Dragons. You see, not all the characters from A Storm of Swords receive follow-up in A Feast for Crows. In fact, half the point of view characters that we've come to know and love from the previous entries in the series are actually held off for the companion book to A Feast for Crows called A Dance with Dragons, the fifth book in the series. Now, originally, George had typed out a manuscript where he wanted to tell the story for all the characters we've come to know and love, in addition to a few additional characters. However, what he soon found out was that the book was becoming incredibly large, it was getting to unpublishable lengths, and therefore he needed to make some sort of decision in order to split the narrative. George explained, "In the case of A Dance with Dragons, which was the book I thought I was writing at the time, I'm passing A Storm of Swords in page count length, and I've hardly started some of the storylines yet. I'd originally, in a crazed sense of optimism, had hoped to deliver A Dance with Dragons in 2002 so it could be published in 2003. So now we're into like 2005, and it's still not out, and it's still not finished, and it's not even close to being finished. Well, what do I have to do? What are my choices?" Now, George's decision to split the narrative between A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons wasn't chronological like a lot of people believed it was going to be, but rather geographically. Meaning that the characters that were predominantly based in King's Landing would have their own story to tell in A Feast for Crows. Meanwhile, during the same timeline, characters that had stories at the Wall, north of the Wall, or in Essos would also be participating in their own story, which was happening chronologically congruent with the events of A Feast for Crows. George explains his reasoning for this in his May 29, 2005 Nota blog. "It was my feeling that we were better off telling all the story for half the characters rather than half the story for all the characters. Cutting the novel in half would have produced 2 half novels. Our approach will produce 2 novels taking place simultaneously but set hundreds or even thousands of miles apart and involving different casts of characters." Although George's intentions are good, his rationale for wanting to tell the full story for half the characters ultimately contradicts what wound up happening with both volumes. You see, the story of A Feast for Crows takes place roughly within a 5-month span. However, the story of A Dance with Dragons actually goes about 3 months past the end of A Feast for Crows, meaning that not only are both books not an exact even split of the same timeline, but the events of A Feast for Crows aren't even the full story for half the characters it promised to tell. George believes that this geographic split was the best solution given the circumstances. However, I believe that there was a better alternative to this large story conundrum. First of all, A Feast for Crows and especially A Dance with Dragons have a bit of a bloat problem. I'll touch on the bloat problems in A Dance with Dragons whenever we review that book in a separate video. However, when looking specifically at A Feast for Crows, this book has the longest chapters in the series. Although each of the first 3 books in the A Song of Ice and Fire series saw linear increases in their chapter lengths when analyzing average words per chapter, A Feast for Crows experienced a dramatic increase in chapter length when compared to A Storm of Swords. The difference is especially noticeable when looking at the average page count of 21.2 pages per chapter. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with having longer chapters, but not all the chapters in this book justify their length. In fact, you can eliminate about 87 pages from this book and nothing of substance would be necessarily lost from the story. Besides some of the Iron Islands chapters, there's a key POV character whose story drags quite a bit at the beginning, and I'll delve more into that in the spoiler section. If you remove the unnecessary pages from both A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, you're left with 2 tightly written books that have substantially more breathing room to maneuver some of the chapters around. Without delving too deeply into spoilers, there's a specific plot twist in A Feast for Crows where you could conceivably end the book and come away satisfied with the story. If you intertwine the events of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons that occur prior to this plot twist, not only have you included everyone's story in this alternative A Feast for Crows, but you can also continue the story right from this plot twist in A Dance with Dragons in chronological order. Moreover, the extra breathing room left behind by the removal of bloat from both books could have allowed George to include his famous Missing A Dance with Dragons chapters that ultimately got pushed back to the Winds of Winter, thus bringing A Dance with Dragons to a more satisfying conclusion. Now, last year, when I read A Feast for Crows for the first time, I was warned ahead of time that both this book and A Dance with Dragons were 2 halves of the same story, and I knew that was going to frustrate the heck out of me, because I wanted to find out what happened with all of the characters following A Storm of Swords. So I went online and found a reading order called the All Leather Must Be Boiled reading order. And essentially what that is a comprehensive list of all the chapters in both A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, but organized in a way where you tell this one giant story, but told in a chronological manner. And I went about and did that for my first read-through. However, the problem with the All Leather Must Be Boiled reading order is that because both A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons have a bit of bloat to them, not only is it a massive, massive undertaking to read 2,000 pages worth of material in one read-through, but what you get is a book that feels just substantially bloated. There's so many POV characters, there's a lot going on all at once. You also go 50 chapters between some of these POV characters. You tend to forget, oh, like, this person, what was this person up to again? Like, it's been so long since I've read about that person's POV. However, I think for my intents and purposes, I preferred that as opposed to having read both books separately. Now, if you, as a first-time reader, decide that, hey, I want to go and just read these books separately, I don't want to do a weird reading order in order to combine these chapters chronologically, you can read this book by itself, and I think, honestly, you'll come away having a good time reading it. But the fact that so many characters are missing from this story, I'm just not a fan of it. Now, the character split was one of the things that George struggled with when he was trying to write A Feast for Crows. The other being, he was struggling with what he eventually called the 5-year gap problem. Essentially what that boils down to is he wanted to do a 5-year gap at the end of A Storm of Swords in order to grow up some of the child characters and have them grow into the roles that were designated for them in the previous books. However, George later explained in an interview that there was a couple of logistical problems that were involved with performing a 5-year gap in the story. Initially, I started with the intention of skipping a number of years after the end of A Storm of Swords and picking up the story 5 years later, the intention there being to let some of the younger child characters grow up a bit. And while it worked for them, it didn't work well for the adult characters who were in the midst of things. I struggled with it as I found I had to do a lot of flashbacks. I had to postulate that nothing much had happened in certain storylines for 5 years, which struck me as false. Now, your fondness for A Feast for Crows will depend on how willing you are to invest yourself in Planetos, as in the entire world that this series takes place, as a character. A Feast for Crows, rather than narrowing the scope towards a conclusion, rather surprisingly, it decides to expand the lore of the world. And there's a lot of neat, interesting details about the world, specifically with regards to Dorne, which is in southern Westeros, and the Iron Islands, which are the islands where Theon Greyjoy grew up in. However, if you just want to read about the characters that you've previously learned about in the series, and you don't necessarily have an interest in the politics and machinations of what's going on in the other locations besides King's Landing and Winterfell, then you're probably going to have a little bit of a problem with the story, because this story does expand the scope and really just delves into those other locations. Now, when you're reading the book, you can usually tell which chapters are the ones that are going to delve into some of the lore, rather than using the traditional chapter headers from the previous books where you saw the name of the person prior to reading the chapter. Now you see something like the Prophet, or Captain of the Guards, or the Kraken's daughter, and that usually entails this particular chapter is from the point of view from someone who is in Dorne, or from someone who is on the Iron Islands, or from just whatever. I do find it interesting, especially the Dornish chapters. I love the Dornish chapters. The Iron Islands, I like them too. Not as much as Dorne. But again, one of the things that I have a problem with is just some of the bloat. There are a couple of instances where I'm reading all this information and I find myself asking, why am I reading about it? I don't need to know about the prophet Aaron Damphair stepping on some weeds with his black calloused feet. I don't need to know about Samuel Tarly seeing a woman's breasts. The actual content when it comes to the political situations in these isolated areas is good, but I don't need to know about all these miscellaneous details that don't really build the world or don't really even expand on the characters they're trying to tell about. It's just information that's there for the sake of being information. So those are my general thoughts, guys, with regards to the structure of A Feast for Crows, and just what I think about the story in a non-spoiler way. If you can get past the character split and some of the bloat problems that plague this book, A Feast for Crows is George R.R. Martin's strongest prose in the series. Seriously, guys, this is, in my opinion, the best written book of all the 5 books that I've read. The politics that go on, the character building, it's fantastically immersive. There are so many monologues, there's so much description, it's all vivid, it's all in your head, it's well written, and I hold that this, if it weren't for the character split, this would be the best book in the series. But with all that said, guys, there's a couple things I want to go over in the spoiler section, so if you have not read A Feast for Crows or A Dance with Dragons, please click off this video, because I will be going full bore on the spoilers for A Feast for Crows, and that includes information from the books prior to this and the books that follow. So beware. Now, I've touched on how this book has 87 pages worth of bloat and filler, and most of those 87 pages can be attributed to one point of view character in particular, and that's Brienne of Tarth. Now, personally, I love the character of Brienne of Tarth. I think she is a fantastic interpretation of what a knight is supposed to be in this world. However, the adventure that she is on, it's not my favorite story. Jaime Lannister had set Brienne to go on this quest to essentially find Sansa Stark. However, her adventure in the Riverlands is slightly frustrating, to say the least, especially when you consider the fact that she's not any closer to finding Sansa. This story hits way too many dead ends. Why am I spending my time reading about Brienne's little adventure with a dwarf in Duskendale? Why am I spending my time as she meets up with Shadrick, who is a knight that's touched upon a little bit at the end of the story? Her story only gets more interesting when she comes across Podrick Payne and then especially Hyle Hunt. And you do get a lot of character moments between the 3 of them, and it's wonderful, especially when they meet up with Septon, who has the coolest monologue in the book, the Broken Man speech. George could have easily moved some of the highlights from some of these chapters and essentially just concentrated them as flashbacks in one of the later Brienne chapters. She could have recounted, oh, well, at one point in my story, I met up with Shadrick and we didn't do anything. Or, hey, this dwarf told me to go to this location in Maidenpool and meet up with this nimble dick guy who told me to go meet this fool. Not all of it, but quite a bit of it could have definitely been shrunken down, removed, or just played in one of the later chapters as flashback, just so that the reader is aware of what Brienne had done without actually living through the day-to-day of what she is doing. Now, this does get remedied in the second half of Brienne's story when she meets up with Septon Meribald and she goes to the elder brother and she fights with Biter, and then especially at the very end when she has that very haunting encounter with Lady Stoneheart, who is the resurrected Catelyn Stark. But I personally just wasn't a fan of some of the build-up to get to that point. Now, as I mentioned previously, I'm a huge fan of the expansion of the lore. However, besides a little bit of the bloat problems, another thing that I have a problem with is the POVs that George chooses to tell the story of the politics in the Iron Islands. The Prophet Aaron Damphair and the Iron Captain Victarion Greyjoy. Both characters, in my opinion, are not exactly the most fleshed out characters. To me, they feel like one and a half dimensional characters. Now, I understand that both Aaron and Victarion's purpose is to tell the story of the Kingsmoot through their eyes as they see their evil supervillain magical brother, Euron Greyjoy, get elected as King of the Iron Islands. George wanted to have eyeballs on Euron Greyjoy without necessarily making Euron a point of view character. However, I feel that there's other characters who could have told Euron's story without necessarily following Victarion or Aaron Damphair. I think it would have been more interesting to see Euron's rise through the eyes of Asha Greyjoy, who I do find to be a very interesting character. With that said, I do like the moment close to the end of the Kingsmoot where Euron Greyjoy is absolutely terrified that Euron has been elected as King of the Iron Islands. He's kind of bracing himself for the worst in this haunting moment of pathos. The cry swelled, became a roar.
Euron, Crow's Eye, Euron King.
It rolled up Naga's hill, like the storm god rattling the clouds.
Euron.
Even a priest may doubt, even a prophet may know terror. Aaron Damphair reached within himself for his god, and discovered only silence. In my opinion, Euron Crow's-Eye Greyjoy is easily just the most fascinating and interesting enigma within the series. So much so that you could say that the title of Feast for Crows isn't necessarily a metaphor for all the people that are trying to scavenge the corpses and create this new kingdom that rises from the ashes, but rather, a feast for crows is a feast for a crow, the ultimate crow, Euron Crow's-Eye Greyjoy. Crow's Eye, you call me? Well, who has a keener eye than the crow? After every battle, the crows come in their hundreds and their thousands to feast upon the fallen. A crow can espy death from afar, and I say that all of Westeros is dying. Those who follow me will feast until the end of their days. Now, although I'm not a fan of the book split between A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, I do appreciate how each book focuses on their own respective supervillain. This book with Euron Greyjoy, and A Dance with Dragons with Ramsay Bolton. And it'll be very interesting to see how their stories get followed up on in The Winds of Winter, as that book promises to tell the continuation of the stories that take place in both these books. In addition to the politics of Dorne and the Iron Islands, which I really like, especially Dorne, number one thing that I'm a huge fan of in this book, and I love that 17 of the 46 chapters are dedicated to this, are the Cersei Lannister chapters and the Jaime Lannister chapters. Cersei Lannister, she's all over this book. She is a fantastic POV character. It is just so hilariously dark and wonderfully interesting to get into the head of this villainess, who just does everything in her power to completely shoot herself in the foot by driving a wedge between her and the Tyrells, by electing this witless council. It's just fantastically hilarious, and I loved every single Cersei chapter, especially the ones where she interacts with Jaime Lannister, who's also our second mega POV of this book. Let all of King's Landing see the flames. It'll be a lesson to our enemies. Now you sound like Aerys. Her nostrils flared. Guard your tongues, sir. I love you too, sweet sister. She also makes the baffling decision to arm the Faith, essentially creating a Faith militant group in order to, quote-unquote, protect King's Landing, and it ultimately backfires on her in the very end in the most just a tragically karma-esque way possible. Like, she did all this horrible stuff. She slept around with all these Kingsguards people just so that she could get them on her side so that she can attempt to assassinate Queen Marjorie, who, by the way, also has this moment at the very end where she completes her character arc and she sees Cersei for who she really is. Will you make me call my Gowlers and have you dragged away, you vile, scheming, evil bitch? It's just beautiful. And her descent into paranoia also parallels Jaime's own journey as he kind of rises towards becoming the knight that he was never seen as, this honorable knight. Jaime has this wonderful moment in the Riverlands where A, he ends a siege at Riverrun in the most bloodless way possible so that he keeps his promise to Catelyn Stark where he didn't raise arms against Tully or Stark. B, he also dismisses a lot of the Freys, just kind of showing that, you know, these Freys are just terrible people, like, good riddance to them. And C, his time away allows him to kind of think to himself and realize that, hey, Cersei's kind of not a fun person to be around. Who is this woman that I once loved? Come at once, she said. Help me. Save me. I need you now as I have never needed you before. I love you. I love you. I love you. Come at once. Does my lord wish to answer? The maester asked after a long silence. A snowflake landed on the letter. As it melted, the ink began to blur. Jaime rolled the parchment up again, as tight as one hand would allow, and handed it to Peck. No, he said. Put this in the fire. To go from the very first book where Jaime and Cersei were having some incestuous moments to Jaime just kind of completely blackballing her sister, and it's a very good conclusion to a character arc. There's other moments from this book that I really enjoyed. I loved Sansa kind of slowly learning to play the game in the Vale as she kind of starts learning how to lie a little bit, despite the fact that Littlefinger comes across as a creep, especially in a second read-through. Oh my gosh, like, he's like forcing her to kiss him, and then criticizing. It's like, oh, was that really a kiss? You should kiss me more, daughter. It's like, oh. And then Arya's training journey, and then Samwell finally arrives at Old Town after having to say tragic goodbye to Aemon Targaryen. There's a lot of other moments that I really like from this story that just, I think, make A Feast for Crows an overall very great read. And again, if you can separate the fact that this isn't the full story, then I think you'll come away really loving this book. So all in all, ladies and gentlemen, character split decision aside, I thought this was George's strongest work, and I am looking forward to seeing if you guys consider this to be maybe your favorite book or most misunderstood book, or what you guys just think about A Feast for Crows. My next video will be a review of a first-time read-through of a book called Knights of the Seven Kingdoms, which consists of 3 novellas following the adventures of Dunk and Egg. It's a book also written by George R.R. Martin, and I'm really looking forward to reading that book. I feel like I need a palate cleanser after A Feast for Crows. Don't get me wrong, I love these books. But I feel like if I keep going at the pace that I'm going to get burned out by this series. A Dance with Dragons was my least favorite book on a first read-through, and I feel like I'm not going to be very positive on this book on a second read-through if I'm feeling burned out. So I just kind of want to take a little bit of a break from the main series and just kind of focus on something else from George R.R. Martin's catalog, whilst still staying within my wheelhouse and not completely alienating myself to, well, the 12 of you that watch these videos, which thank you very much, by the way, for those of you who do. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So please look forward to that, ladies and gentlemen. In the meantime, have a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year, whatever you choose to celebrate, guys, and I'll see you guys next time. The Advocate,